and a lovely woman alive. Briefly described, top-class blonde, took in a young girl left by her parents, unaware she carried a miracle he'd prayed for. The market buzzed with the coarse sounds of livestock, the clang of worn metal, and the scent of dust kicked up by boots that had walked too many miles. Autumn in Wyoming brought a chill to the wind, sharper than most years, and it crept down the spines of those gathered along the outer stalls. The traders shouted over one another, bartering sacks of potatoes for bullets or chickens for firewood. But in one far corner, a different kind of trade was taking place. "She's strong enough to sweep a floor and chop weeds," the man barked, his voice raw from liquor. "No trouble, unless you let her rest too long. Take her off my hands for $2. Maybe a sack of oats if you've got 'em." His coat was threadbare, his boots split at the toes. Next to him stood a girl wrapped in an oversized shawl, arms crossed tight around her chest. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her head was bowed, hair unwashed and tangled beneath a bonnet pulled low over her eyes. She didn't speak, not once. She didn't plead or cry out or look for help. She only stared at the ground, hands twisting into the fabric of her skirt, clutching it like a lifeline. The man standing beside her, her father, if the resemblance was any sign, shoved her forward. "She eats little, hardly says a word. Won't be much bother." Some laughed. One man nudged another, whispering, "Looks like she broke already. That one's got no fire left." On the edge of the gathering crowd stood Reed Carson. He had not come to buy a girl. He had come for nails and maybe a barrel of salt, but his boots had stilled when he caught sight of the trembling figure near the wagon. At 41, Reed had seen his fair share of what desperation did to a man. He had seen worse during the war, worse still after it. His beard was grizzled, his coat worn but clean, and though he had not smiled in years, there was something behind his weathered eyes that still saw beauty in broken things. He watched as another man offered $1.50 and a flask of corn whiskey. The girl flinched, the father considered. Reed stepped forward. $3, he said flatly. "And you never speak her name again." The father looked up, eyes narrowed. "You buying or rescuing, mister? Makes a difference to me." Reed didn't answer. He pulled the coins from his pocket and dropped them into the man's cracked palm. The clink of metal was final. The man snorted, motioned to the girl without looking, and spat into the dirt. "She's yours now. May she do better by you." The crowd lost interest just as fast as it had gathered. There was no violence, no protest, just the slow collapse of a girl's shoulders as she realized her fate had changed hands again. Reed turned to her. "Can you walk?" She nodded. "Then come." She hesitated, eyes flickering from his boots to his face. Reed pulled off his coat, a faded gray wool with stitched patches, and held it out. "You'll freeze before we get halfway up the ridge," he said. "Put this on." She reached for it with uncertain hands. The moment she touched it, she paused. Her fingers trembled as they ran over the lining, and then, quietly, without a sound, she began to cry. It was not a loud cry, not a cry meant for attention. It was the kind of weeping born in silence, built in corners, and buried under years of being unseen. She held the coat against her chest, tears soaking into the fabric, and looked up at him with an expression that was not quite hope, but not hopeless either. Reed said nothing. He only turned toward the wagon, motioning for her to follow. She climbed up beside him, still clutching the coat like it might vanish if she let go. As they rode north, away from the market and the whispers, away from the father who never looked back, the girl sat in silence, and Reed let her be. He did not ask her name. Not yet. Names were earned where he came from, but in his mind he called her the girl from nowhere. And for the first time in a long while, Reed Carson felt the stirrings of something he had once buried deep beneath grief and pine soil. He did not know then that she carried a secret. Nor did he know that the child inside her, still small, still unseen, was the very miracle his late wife had prayed for every night, until her dying breath. But he would learn. Oh, he would learn. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen dirt, each turn echoing into the stillness of the woods. A bitter wind slid through the pine trees, shaking their needles with icy fingers. Reed held the reins steady, his eyes on the trail. Beside him, the girl wrapped his coat tighter around herself. She hadn't spoken since they left the market. Not a question, not a thank you, only silence. Reed understood silence. The path twisted through evergreens dusted with frost. They crossed a narrow creek, its surface glazed in thin ice. The mare hesitated, hooves crunching, until Reed murmured to her and she stepped forward. The girl stared down into the cracked water, knuckles white where she gripped the wagon's side. "Gets colder the farther up we go," Reed said after a while, his voice low. "Wind rolls off the ridge like it's got a mean streak." She gave no answer. He glanced at her, then added, "You don't have to talk. Not until you want to. I'll call you Kid for now." She didn't reply, but her shoulders eased, just slightly. That was enough. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun had fallen behind the ridge. The cabin sat between aspens and dense pine. Its roof bowed slightly with time. Smoke trickled from the chimney. The porch slanted, but the windows were clean. A home built by a man who had nothing else to build for but the days ahead. Reed brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He offered his hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were cold, too thin. He helped her up the steps and pushed open the door. Warmth greeted them. Pine heat, soft and dry. The cast-iron stove glowed, filling the room with a low hum. It smelled of ash and herbs. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo above the hearth. A woman's face, smiling, Reed's wife. Her name hadn't been spoken in years. The girl paused in the doorway. Reed moved ahead, removed his coat, and went to the stove. He ladled soup from a kettle and poured it into a clay bowl, then set it on the table and pulled out a chair. "Sit," he said. She did, slowly. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why. He simply pushed the bowl toward her. "Venison and potatoes. Bit bland. You'll eat better once you learn to cook it yourself." She lifted the spoon with both hands, trembling slightly. As the first sip touched her tongue, she closed her eyes. Reed leaned against the counter, watching the wind rattle the windows. Then, without turning, he said, "There's a cot in the back. Clean blanket, firewood stacked. If you need to wash, I'll heat water." He hesitated, then added, "And don't worry about staying quiet. Nobody here hits you for silence." She froze, her spoon stopped. Her eyes met his. He said nothing else, just walked to the stove, stirred the fire, and closed the door. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, something gentler stirred. She finished the bowl slowly. Her eyes drifted to the photo above the fireplace, studying the woman's kind smile. She didn't ask who she was. Reed didn't offer. Names could come later. For now, there was warmth, a bowl of soup, a place to sit, and a man who didn't demand answers. It wasn't much, but to her, it was everything. And in the quiet, something began to shift, something small, flickering, but real. The kind of warmth that could outlast winter. The days settled into quiet rhythm, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the occasional rustle of pine needles brushing against the cabin walls. Reed rarely spoke unless there was a reason, and the girl, still nameless to him, did not seem to mind. She rose early, helped stack logs, swept the floor, and clumsily tried her hand at boiling oats or peeling potatoes. Her first attempts at cooking left the cabin smelling faintly of smoke and half-scorched flour, but she never gave up. She was not graceful. She spilled water, dropped kindling, burned her knuckles once, and hid it under her sleeve. But she worked. Reed saw the effort in her eyes, even when her hands trembled with cold or fatigue. He never scolded. When she couldn't start the fire one morning, he knelt beside her, picked up the flint, and showed her again, slowly, without words. "You strike it like this," he murmured, taking her small fingers and guiding them over the metal. A spark danced and caught on the dry moss, flickering into life. She watched it, wide-eyed, as though it were a miracle. Later that week, he brought out the hatchet. "Need more wood before the storm," he said, gesturing to the pile outside. She followed him in silence. The wind bit at their cheeks, but the sun lit the snow in blinding silver. Reed showed her how to split kindling, how to brace the block, where to grip. Her first swing was too soft, the second missed entirely. "Let me help," he said, stepping behind her. He placed his calloused hands over hers, not to control but to guide. She stiffened slightly, unaccustomed to touch that asked for nothing, but she did not pull away. Together they swung, and the wood split clean. She turned, looked up at him, breath visible in the cold. He met her eyes briefly, steady, warm, but stepped back. Distance, respect. It mattered. That night, over a meal of rabbit stew that tasted only slightly of salt, she finally spoke. "My name is Eva." Reed looked up but said nothing. "My parents, they threw me out," she continued, voice tight. "When they found out I was pregnant, said I'd brought shame, but when they tried to sell me, they told no one. Who'd buy a girl carrying someone else's mistake?" She laughed softly, bitterly. "Guess they figured silence made me more marketable." She looked at him then, as if bracing for judgment. Reed set down his spoon. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing along the cabin walls. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood, walked to the hooks near the door, pulled down his coat, and disappeared outside. Eva sat alone at the table, hands clenched, breath shallow. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then the door opened again. Reed stepped in, snow melting from his boots, and walked to the table. In his hands was a cloth sack. He set it down in front of her. "Rice, oats, lentils," he said simply. "Enough for 2, till spring." Eva stared at the bag, then at him. He met her gaze with quiet certainty. "You're not alone now." Tears welled up, but she blinked them back. No sobbing, no dramatics. Just the slow return of something long buried. Dignity. She nodded once, firmly. "Thank you." Reed returned to his bowl, sat down, and resumed eating. No further words were needed. Outside the wind began to howl. Winter was coming fast. But inside that cabin, for the first time since the girl had arrived, there was more than warmth in the fire. There was room for 2. Winter came without mercy. The pines bent under the weight of fresh snow, and the world turned a deep, unrelenting white. Each morning, Reed rose early to break the ice on the water barrel and haul in firewood. Eva, slower now, moved with hands pressed against her growing belly. Her energy waned, and her steps shortened. The cabin, once shared in silence, became filled with small, thoughtful sounds, water boiling, kindling cracking, the soft scrape of her spoon as she stirred porridge for 2. Her belly was no longer a secret. The child she carried moved beneath her skin like a whisper of what was to come. Reed watched from the edges. He kept his words few and his movements steady, but his eyes lingered longer than before. Sometimes he would catch himself staring at the slight curve of her figure, at the way she cradled herself when she thought no one saw. And in those quiet moments, memory would reach out from the firelight. He remembered the night his wife died. It had snowed just like this, soft and suffocating. They had tried for years, letters to doctors, prayers by candlelight, tinctures that tasted like smoke. When she finally carried, they dared to hope. But the child came too early, and the bleeding would not stop. He remembered her hands cold and reaching, the blood, the stillness. He had buried them both beneath the spruce tree near the edge of the clearing. After that, he vowed to live alone, to speak less, to feel nothing. And yet, he found himself carving again, not with purpose, just to keep his hands busy, or so he told himself. But the block of pine wood in his palm slowly took shape, a tiny doll, rounded head, small notches for eyes, arms folded across its chest. One morning, Eva found it on the table beside her bowl of stew. She picked it up, ran a thumb along the grooves, and looked at him with the beginnings of a smile. He only nodded and went back to chopping firewood. Later that week, he fixed the back door to her room, patching the warped frame with new boards and sealing the cracks with wool. He said it was for the draft, but when Eva touched the wall that night, it was warm for the first time. One evening, after a long day of snow and silence, Reed sat alone beside the fire. He held a threadbare wool sweater in his lap, his wife's, soft with age and memory. The sleeves had torn, the hem unraveled. But he threaded the needle anyway. Clumsily at first. Then, with care, he stitched each seam, reinforced the cuffs, folded it neatly. The blue wool still held her scent, faint but real. When Eva came in from the outhouse later that night, it was waiting for her on her bed. She stopped in the doorway, staring. Her hand went to her mouth. She stepped forward, picked up the sweater and sank down onto the edge of the mattress. She pressed it to her chest, burying her face in the fabric. Then the tears came. They were not the tears of shame or fear. These were tears of release. "I thought," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I thought I would give birth out here, alone, that no one would care if I lived or died." Reed stood in the hallway, unseen, unmoving, but he heard every word. He did not go to her. Instead, he turned away and added another log to the fire. He watched the flames climb higher, and in their light he saw that some promises, like the ones made in grief, were never meant to last. Snow gathered thick along the ridgelines, muffling sound and movement. Eva moved slowly now, her body full with child, her steps careful. Reed chopped wood each morning, stacking it high. Eva stayed near the fire, knitting blankets and tiny socks from scraps, little hopes made by hand. One morning, with frost still clinging to the window panes and the sky a dull gray, the sharp sound of hooves broke the calm. Reed, sharpening a blade near the hearth, set it down and went to the door. Through the frosted glass, he saw a man on horseback ride into the clearing. Tall in the saddle, coat too fine for wilderness, his face was shaded beneath a trimmed felt hat. The rider dismounted and walked to the door with the arrogance of someone used to taking what he wanted. He knocked. 3 sharp raps. Reed opened the door. "You Reed Carson?" the man asked, adjusting his gloves. "Jeremiah Boone. I'm here to speak with the girl." Reed's eyes narrowed. "What for?" Jeremiah smirked. "Just checking in. Word is she's been living up here. Thought I might have a right to know." "What kind of right?" Jeremiah's voice dropped, slick with implication. "Blood." Before Reed could respond, Ava's voice came from behind him, sharp, clear. "I'll speak to him." She stepped out, wrapped in the patched sweater Reed had mended, arms folded over her belly. Her walk was slow but firm as she came to stand beside Reed. Jeremiah's smirk faltered. "Eva, you look, well." She said nothing. He gestured at her belly. "Heard you were still alive. And expecting. Thought maybe I should do the right thing. Maybe be in the kid's life." Her eyes flashed. "You watched my father throw me out and said nothing. You turned away when I needed you. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." He raised his hands. "I just want to be part of the child's life. He's my son." "You don't get to call him that," Eva snapped. "You gave up that right the day you walked away. You didn't ask if I was safe. You didn't help. And now you think you can claim something just because it's convenient?" He opened his mouth, but she cut him off. "You think blood makes a father?" she asked, stepping forward, one hand on her belly. "This child is more than flesh. He's the one thing I thought I'd never be allowed to keep." Jeremiah's face hardened. "He's still mine." "No," Eva said, voice rising. "He isn't. A father stays. A father doesn't run." She turned to Reed, her voice breaking. "This child already has a father, one who gave us warmth, safety, and a home without asking for anything in return." She looked back at Jeremiah. "My son has a father, and it isn't you." Reed hadn't moved, but now he stepped forward and laid his hand on Eva's shoulder. A quiet gesture, but one that spoke everything. Jeremiah's face turned red, jaw tight. For a second, Reed thought he might strike, but then the man turned, fists clenched, and walked to his horse. He rode off without a word, without a glance back. Eva stood still, breathing hard, one hand over the baby who shifted softly inside her. Reed didn't speak. He didn't need to. Inside the cabin, the fire burned strong, and something stronger still, an unbreakable bond, born not from blood, but from choice. The fever came quietly, riding on a breath of wind that slipped in through the cracked windows and settled in Eva's bones. At first she simply moved slower, her cheeks pale, her voice softer, but by nightfall She was shivering uncontrollably, teeth chattering as she lay curled beneath every quilt Reed could find. He sat beside her bed, a bowl of steaming water on the table, cloth draped across her forehead. The fire roared, but the cold inside her would not yield. Her skin burned with heat and ice at once. Reed knew that feeling. He had seen it before, had watched helplessly as it stole warmth from the woman he loved. Not again. He went to the cabinet beside the hearth, fingers fumbling through the small wooden boxes lined in dust. At last he found the bundle of dried roots, crushed angelica, white pine bark, and meadowsweet. His wife had used them when the fevers came, whispering prayers as she stirred. He did not pray now, but he ground the herbs, steeped them in boiling water, and coaxed Eva to drink with a tenderness that surprised even himself. "You need to sweat it out," he muttered, brushing hair from her damp brow. "Stay with me now." All through the night he changed the cloth on her forehead, added logs to the fire, and held her hand as her breaths grew shallow, then strong again. When the fever finally broke near dawn, Eva opened her eyes and blinked at the flickering light. "You're still here," she rasped. Reed gave a half-smile. "Didn't have plans to go anywhere." Her lips quivered. I didn't think someone like me, someone used and left, could be worth this much care." Reed looked at her for a long moment, then stood and walked to the tall chest at the far end of the room. He knelt, pulled open the bottom drawer, and reached inside. When he returned, he held a small leather-bound journal, worn soft by time. He placed it in her hands. "My wife's," he said simply. "She wrote in it most nights, never showed it to anyone, but I figure she'd want you to read it now." Eva opened the first page with trembling fingers. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was elegant, looping. She began to read in a whisper. "If I could hold a child of my own, I think I would cry every day for a year, not for sorrow, but because I would finally know what it means to be full." A tear slid down Eva's cheek. She turned the pages slowly. Entry after entry described dreams of motherhood, of lullabies and tiny boots, of the way a baby might look curled in her arms on a winter morning. "I didn't know she wanted it so much," Eva whispered. Reed sat back down, his voice low. "She did. More than anything. We tried, and when it didn't happen, it hollowed her out. She never blamed me, just blamed time." Eva ran a hand over her belly, where life still kicked gently beneath her skin. Then, slowly, she laid the journal over her heart. "I never knew my child would be wanted by someone other than me," she said softly. "But I want you to know, Reed. I want this baby to have a name that means something." She turned her head toward him, eyes shining. "I want to name her after your wife." Reed's breath caught. For a moment, all he could do was stare. Then he nodded once, fiercely, as though something long locked away had been freed. "Her name was Lillian," he said, voice hoarse. Eva smiled. "Then Lillian she'll be." In the hush that followed, it was as if the old cabin itself sighed with something deep and unseen. The fire cracked, the wind outside softened, and in the space between heartbreak and healing, an old heart found a new reason to beat. The snow came heavier now, deeper than before, covering the world in white that swallowed sound and color alike. Reed kept a shovel near the front door, using it daily just to carve a path through the thick drifts. Inside, the fire never died. He chopped wood by the hour, his hands raw and splintered, but the house remained warm, safe. Eva's belly had grown full, round as a winter moon. She moved slower, her breath shorter, and sometimes he would find her staring out the window with a look of quiet dread. She never said it aloud, but Reed knew she was afraid. He remembered that fear. He had seen it in Lillian's eyes, too, just days before the end. Now, with each passing hour, Eva's unease grew. Reed said little, but he did more than speak ever could. He boiled water, gathered cloth, dried herbs for pain and fever. He lined drawers with swaddling blankets she had knitted. He made a cradle from pine, carved it with her favorite flowers, and placed it by the hearth. Every step was precise, deliberate, a man building a sanctuary with his hands. One evening, Eva stood in the doorway, the wind tangling her loose hair, one hand resting against the side of the cabin for balance. The snow reached nearly to her knees, yet she didn't move, just stared out into the storm, like it could answer something she hadn't dared to ask. Reed came to her quietly. "You shouldn't be out in this," he said. Eva turned her face to him, eyes soft but stormy. "I needed air." She looked down at her belly, then up again, voice wavering. "I've been thinking, when the baby comes, if I want to leave after, will you stop me?" The question sat heavy in the space between them. Reed didn't answer at first. He looked past her, at the endless drift of white, and the trees bowing beneath the cold. Then, slowly, he stepped closer. He reached out, hesitant, and placed his hand on the curve of her belly. The warmth of life pulsed beneath his fingers. The child moved, as if to greet him. His voice broke as he spoke. "You don't need to run," he said. "You and this child, you're the reason I came back to life." Eva blinked. "I don't understand." "I buried my wife in the snow out there," he said, nodding toward the grove. "And when I did, I buried everything else with her." Laughter. Hope. Even God, maybe. His eyes found hers. "Then one day I walked into a market and saw a girl being treated like a mule. And I saw something in her eyes. Something that looked too much like what I used to see in my own." He swallowed hard. "I didn't save you because I wanted to be some kind of hero, Eva. I saved you because I didn't want to be dead anymore." The tears came quietly to her eyes, but she did not look away. "And this baby," he continued, his hand still resting gently over her womb, "this baby isn't a burden, she's not a mistake. She's a second chance." He stepped back then, just enough to give her breath. "If you still want to leave after she's born, I won't stop you," he said. "But you need to know, you have a home here, a family, and no one's going to chase you out again." Eva looked at him, and in her eyes bloomed something stronger than fear. Trust. She stepped forward and leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. "I never had someone say that to me," she whispered. "Not once. Not in all the years I was told I was trouble. Not when I was sold. Not when I was left." Reed wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if she might break. "You're not trouble," he murmured. "You're a blessing, both of you." Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, but inside, the world held still. In that hush between snowfall and silence, between heartache and healing, two people stood in the doorway of something neither of them had dared to hope for. And the child in Eva's womb stirred again, alive, waiting, ready. The storm came without mercy. Wind screamed across the mountains, slamming into the cabin with fists of snow and ice. The fire blazed high, shadows dancing madly along the walls. Inside, Reed moved with urgency, stoking the flames, heating water, spreading clean cloths across the table. Eva's cries echoed through the small space, sharp, strained, cracking with both pain and determination. She was on the cot, her face pale, hair soaked with sweat. Her hands gripped the edges of the blanket as another wave of agony rolled through her. Reed was beside her, kneeling, heart pounding harder than it ever had, even in battle. He had seen death before. He had watched his wife fade away while he held her hand and could do nothing to stop it. But not this time. This time he would fight. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice shaking. "You're strong, Eva. You've got this." She gritted her teeth and screamed again, tears spilling from her eyes. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he said, brushing her forehead with trembling fingers. "You're not alone." Hours passed. The wind howled. Reed boiled more water, whispered encouragement, held her when the fear took over. He did not know how to help, not properly. But he gave everything, his hands, his voice, his heart. And then, at last, in the deep hour before dawn, a new sound joined the storm. A cry, small, piercing, alive. Eva collapsed back against the pillows, tears falling freely now, but from joy. Reed cradled the tiny, wriggling girl in his arms, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and stared down at her in stunned silence. She was perfect, red-faced, loud, fierce already, and breathing. Reed did not realize he was crying until Eva looked up at him, her voice a whisper. "You're the reason she was born safe," she said. "You're the reason she's here." He turned to her, knelt beside her bed, and gently placed the baby into her arms, but she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "She's yours too." She lifted the child back into his arms, watched as he cradled the newborn like a man holding salvation, and in that moment, the weight of years lifted from his chest. The man who had once buried hope beneath snow now held it, alive and warm, against his heart. Spring came late that year, but it came nonetheless. The snow melted slowly, revealing green beneath. Birds returned. The pines shook off their burden and reached skyward once more. Inside the cabin, life had changed forever. At the table by the window sat 3 figures. Eva, glowing with quiet strength. Reed, older but softened, laughter lines returning to a face that had long forgotten how to smile. And between them, little Lillian, wide-eyed and curious, clutching her father's thumb like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. Each night they shared meals, stories, and silence that no longer felt empty. Each morning they woke to the sound of birds and the soft babble of a child discovering her voice. They were not bound by blood. They were bound by something stronger. 5 years passed. The town of Willow Creek hosted its spring festival beneath blooming apple trees and banners swaying in the breeze. Children ran between booths, their laughter ringing like music. Couples danced, neighbors exchanged news. Among them walked a family, hand in hand, faces known now to every heart in the valley. Eva Carson, Reed Carson, and their daughter, Hope. She wore a yellow dress with ribbons in her braids and called out, "Pa!" every time she found something new, flowers, pastries, a goat with a silly hat. Reed lifted her into his arms with practiced ease, kissed her forehead, and let her sit on his shoulders as they made their way through the crowd. 2 older women on a bench watched them pass. "Isn't that the girl from years back?" one whispered. "The nameless one, the one they said was sold?" The other shook her head. "No, that's Eva Carson. She's his wife now, and that little girl is their daughter, Hope." Back at the church that summer, Reed and Eva opened a small school for children without parents. They used the same table he had once prepared medicine on. Hope sat proudly on his knee, reciting letters while the other children watched. She never hesitated to call him Pa, never questioned whether the world saw her as his or not. It was truth enough for her. And then, one day, many years later, that same little girl, now grown, now strong, now speaking in her own voice, sat down to write. Her words would echo what had been lived quietly, without ceremony. "I do not share his blood. I do not carry his name by birth. But from his hands I learned kindness. From his eyes I learned courage. And from his silence I learned how to listen for love. He is my father. My mother is the miracle. And I am the proof that something beautiful can grow from what the world tried to throw away." Hope Carson closed her journal, looked out over the land her parents had tended with sweat and memory, and smiled. Love, she knew now, did not need to be claimed by blood. It simply needed to be chosen. And they had chosen each other, every single day. And so, in a land shaped by storms and silence, where pain often outlived hope, one man's quiet act of mercy and one girl's will to survive built something no one expected, a family. Not by blood, but by choice. Not by fate, but by love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale reminds us that even in the dust and danger of the frontier, love can still rise, unexpected, unbroken, and unforgettable. Where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Subscribe now, and we'll see you on the next ride.